why we're here and why this was the perfect venue to host tonight's conversation. And thank you for hosting.
Thanks, Brian. Hello, everyone. That's a really intimate group, so if you want to move in a bit up front, well, I don't think our panel will mind. They're all very friendly. A little introduction. My name is Lauren. I'm a community and operations manager at Haymarket. Anyone of you familiar with this? A few people. For the first timers at Haymarket 2, Australia's first thought about focus on helping entrepreneurs connect with Asia and preparing for global expansion. So we provide a space where people work in our core space of back, connect you to a network of mentors and investors who have vast experience and knowledge and working in Asia. And we also run a lot of events and workshops similar to this that kind of highlights the opportunities there are in Asia. So if you want to learn more, or if you know anyone, or if you are looking for a place to work from, we'll be happy to have a chat. We'll give you a referral fee, give you a free trial. We'll be here all night, so any other information you want to know about it, and thanks for coming tonight, and thanks for listening tonight.
So before I introduce our panelists tonight, I just wanted to give you a little bit of background about why we're hosting this evening. It's in advance of the second trade mission to China, a trade mission with a difference. It's a group of senior business women who were taken for the first one last year in September, and there's a handful of people that were on that delegation in the room. We'll have a chance to involve them in the conversation a bit later. But one of the things I think we found on the trip is that there were so many interesting conversations, many of them that were run through the media, that then when we got in country, there were a lot of things you wanted to ask but felt like it might not be polite, it would be difficult. And so there was a lot of questions when we got back that we probably wanted to have the opportunity to ask and answer. So in the lead up to this year's mission, and if you know anyone that's interested, I can vouch it's a sensational, incredibly interesting trip that looks at AI and fintech this year across a lot of the tier 2 organisations, not the ones you see in the headlines of the news, but the ones that are incredibly powerful companies doing interesting things that we don't hear about. The China Australia Trade and Investment Council, we have the CEO Pan White just here, and a number of other CATIC people. So CATIC will be running the mission, so plenty of time to ask questions after. I'm going to swing to our panellists. Andrea Myles will be known to many people in Haymarket HQ and many people across the innovation sector generally. Just as a bit of, I'll let Andrea talk about CAMP and the project because in itself the structure is really interesting. But you're a Mandarin speaker. Handle Beijing Betty on Twitter.
Beijing Betty. I've already tweeted.
You're on the City of Sydney Chinese New Year Advisory Panel, UTS Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. There's a whole host of kind of things that you do within the community. I think the thing that stands out for me about Andrea is for someone that's invested over a very long period of time understanding China and how she brings that. But you spent a lot of time, you studied there, learned the language. Moving on to Duco Van Breeman. Duco, we've worked together when we had a China conference a few years ago that you moderated. You are General Manager of Haymarket HQ, and before that you lived and worked in China for 7 years, where you helped international companies expand into China and Chinese companies venture abroad. So now you've adapted that experience into the sort of startup community. Jared Mondschein. So Jared is a senior fellow and senior advisor at the US Studies Centre with research that focuses on the US-Australia trade and investment relationship as well as innovation and entrepreneurship. We had a conversation separately and you said, I've lived and worked in China. And I was like, is that right? And you had a really interesting lens on the Australia-US relationship, which is, and then the China relationship, which is sort of stuck in the middle, if you like. So from a geopolitical and also having a background in innovation and entrepreneurship was a delight to welcome you tonight. So please thank the panelists for coming on. So I'm not sure where to start, but I might just start with you, Duco, because it's fresh in your mind, and you've just come back from a delegation to Shanghai. You took some startups there.
Yep.
How did it go? Given that China seems to move incredibly fast, was there a big difference from the last time that you took a delegation? What were the kind of standouts that might distinguish this visit?
Yeah, so just to give you a bit of context, so we set up this thing called the China Campus Challenge, which is an online program to help companies into China together with Alibaba and Australia Post. So we had 400 companies participate, and we took the winners to China. So last week I spent some time in Shanghai and Hangzhou, hadn't been in about a year and a half, and I'd say a lot has changed. We just had actually a good conversation on this, so I spent a bit of time in China. But what you'll realize is that obviously it changes quickly, but also now it's a lot more advanced than most Western nations. From payment, when I first arrived in China, I could only pay in cash, which I found very frustrating coming from Holland, where I could pay with my card. Now I cannot pay in cash, I can only pay with WeChat or Alipay. Even beggars are asking you to swipe a WeChat payment. This is not a joke, actually. I've had it happen to me. So that's a big thing, right? So they're much more advanced in terms of financial technologies, e-commerce, etc. But also what I found was that it's changed a lot in terms of censorship, and I think it's become a little bit more controlled in certain ways. So to give you an example, a few years ago, a year and a half ago, you'd walk the street and be honking, there would be people jaywalking, etc. Now that doesn't even happen, it's very quiet. No people jaywalks. It's actually quite a lot nicer to live in, I think. But why is that the case? It's because every camera has now AI in it, right? So if you cross, say, a red light, this actually happened to a friend of mine. He jaywalks, he crossed a red light. Within 3 minutes, he got a fine from the government on his phone, because they have visual intelligence in these cameras, they understand who you are, it's all linked together. So obviously that is in some ways very nice, in other ways it can be a little bit hard to get used to. So that's something that I thought was quite a change from just a year and a half ago. And many of the companies that we took over were surprised by that as well. So I think a lot of people tend to go to China with the notion, it's China, it's the factory of the world, they still have a lot to learn. It's pretty much the opposite these days. I think we can learn a lot from them. They're a lot more advanced than we think they are. They do a lot of things a lot better than we do, actually. Even Tim Cook says that. They don't, Apple's not in China because it's cheap. Apple's in China because that's where the skills are to actually build the iPhones. So I think for many of those here that have not gone to China yet or haven't been in some time, it's going to be a great experience because it's going to be sort of what Japan was to me 5 years ago. I was like, oh, that's advanced. And China now has taken on that role. So I think in the next 5 years, we'll be able to see a lot of new things coming from China. And Darwin actually just started, I think, trialing also this visual intelligence in cameras. So, if you want to get a taste of it, go to Darwin and see if you get a fine.
It's true, I saw it. Who's smaller? I don't know, I think that's just
I don't know the one in Darwin, but I'd say that probably the Chinese vendor is the best place to.
Jared, I'm going to bring you into the conversation. As I'm reading the questions that I sent, some indicative questions this afternoon, I realised it was an autocorrect that refers to President Trump. So I apologise. I know it actually called me up on it, but one of the things that's very obvious in our trip last year is that there seems to be, when it comes to an appetite for online or entertainment, it's China's main product. So whether it's social networks or video games, entertainment, but then there's a huge appetite for Western fashion and Western, other Western products. So obviously that dichotomy about the consumption of online and social media being kind of cordoned off, but yet an appetite for Western products. And then we have 170 companies signing a letter to President Trump about the impact that the trade war will have on a lot of those companies that sell huge businesses in China. So the tension point between fashion and technology, why it's approached so differently from the Chinese government, and secondly, what will this do? Will China go, okay, fine, we'll just make all of our haute couture here?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the China question in the U.S.-Australia relationship is, as you said at the beginning, the elephant in the room. And the challenge is that it touches on so many different parts. You have, as you said, e-commerce, you have AI, you have fashion, you have culture, you have movies. Everything is changing, and both in China and the U.S. and Australia have to deal with this. So why are shoe companies annoyed with the Trump administration? The shoes got 25% more expensive. That's thanks to the tariffs. That's the simplest reason, but really is that China has spent decades building a supply chain and exporting to the world. It's the factory to the world, etc. that was mentioned earlier, and China's perfected that and done really, really well. Yes, there has been some natural evolving and moving down the supply chains and moving to Southeast Asia as China's gotten more expensive. But the fact of the matter is that China still has basically some of the best supply chain management and skills as well in Asia. But with that said, Southeast Asia is catching up quickly. Another issue, why is haute couture wanted from the West and not China? That gets to something called soft power, and that's sort of more my area than tech. And that's something that this Harvard professor named Joe Nye invented or coined some time ago, talking about soft power of free markets, essentially, the soft power of the U.S. And it's the movies, it's Hollywood, it's jeans, it's fashion, and you can't really invent that. That has to be something that is organic. And China has tried very hard to get soft power and to make people like it, whether it be through Confucius Institutes or language immersion programs and all these different things, but you can't make it like that. You can't force feed people soft power, it's organic. And so the US, the European, Australian brands are still desired more in haute couture than in AI. But that's also because China has focused a lot more on AI, a lot more on digital trade. That is, in many ways, an existential threat to the Chinese Communist Party. If you're going to have, you just have to look at what happened to Edward Snowden revelations and the way that the U.S. had a backdoor into a lot of technology. Do you want, if you're the Chinese Communist Party, do you want to allow U.S. backdoors into your AI, into your innovation? No, you're going to cut them off. And in many ways, the Trump administration is supporting that sort of walling of AI and innovation ties with their latest action about Huawei and ZTE or ZTE constructs. And so yeah, I think so many different, there's a lot going on there, but it's really soft power, the amazing, the limits of it, and the supply chain mastery of China, and the fact that this is touching on so many different facets of the U.S.-Australian and Chinese relations.
We're going to come back to the Huawei type dynamic, because I think there's a whole other interesting difference in the way that the Huawei discussion has been seen through Western eyes versus Chinese eyes, and I'll come back to you on that. And so, Andrea, can I ask you? We spoke with Alice and I were there last week. We spoke with Professor David Walker, who I know you know from Beijing.
Total champ. Yeah.
Who's a total champ. And there's a book that we've got to give away as a door prize, but we've realised that in this crowd, business cards don't cut it, so we're going to have to find another way because everyone's on WeChat. Now he was talking in a conversation with James that I heard a recording of at the end, where he said, where are the bright spots for the China Australia relationship, given all of the fraught discussions that are going on, where next? And he said it's really about the kind of education ties and the student ties. So if you could just run us through camp to start with, and also where are the opportunities and where are the dangers and challenges given the nature of the data?
Okay, all right, I can do that.
Sorry, it's a lot in that question.
Yeah, okay, all right, so stay with me. So I'm the CEO of something called the China Australia Millennial Project. It's a startup that James has known since our very first idea. He was one of the first people that gave us the time of day in 2014, I believe it would be. So what we do is we basically do three things. The thing we're most known for is running a very large, very long innovation accelerator program. It's 100 people strong, it goes for 100 days. 50 people come from China and 50 people come from Australia, and in mixed teams, they basically have to build a startup in 100 days. That startup has to answer a business challenge question posed by our business partners, which include Alibaba, Wesfarmers, EY, Dave Jones, big Australian and Chinese iconic companies. So those businesses pose challenge questions to these 100 bright spots. We've got 100 days to build a solution to that they get to pitch back to the executives of those businesses. When we first started it, we thought, great, we're going to create these really interesting startups that from their very DNA are thinking about Australian market strengths, Chinese market strengths, and have mixed teams in their co-founding makeup. But what we didn't realize is that this, far more than anything, was a relationship accelerator, and that the networks and the bonds that these really smart spending 100 days tied to each other has been the really sort of sustainable output. You know, startups can bust like that. Like, you know, startups are not necessarily that special, despite what any startup will tell you. But relationships are much, much more difficult to come by. So the program itself, yes, it goes for 100 days, but 90 days of that are online and part-time. So you can do it from whether you're in Wuhan, or in Adelaide, or in Sydney, or in Shanghai, wherever. The first 5 days we fly everybody to China, and the last 5 days we fly everybody to Australia. So there's two kind of pylons of the bridge that people get to meet each other face to face when we're in China, to around innovation ecosystem, whether it's Shanghai, Beijing, Shenzhen, wherever. We go into the coolest companies that we can find, whether small or large, and we basically try to blow people's minds. Finally, when everyone comes back down to Sydney, that's a really, really fast-paced hackathon. So people have basically got 5 days face-to-face to capitalize on all that 100 days that they've been working together before they have to stand up in front of some of the biggest names in town, you know, CEO, David Jones, you name it, and, you know, show them what they've got. So the way that we focus 100 people is by picking the top industries that are the biggest opportunities in the Australia-China relationship. The way that we've been able to do that is we take a look at what's in Australia's national interest, what we're good at. We take a look at what's in China's 13th five-year plan, and the overlay of those are basically the kind of future opportunity trajectory where Australia can be most useful to China. Bearing in mind that China's economy is 2,000% bigger than ours and growing at 3 times the rate, so we must be useful to China. That's the most useful thing for both parties. In doing that, we also overlaid Australia's national interest 13th five-year plan with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Because I'll speak frankly here, there's a lot of money to be made in unfucking the world. So, and Australia and China, we can collaborate really well together. So, what that means is we've got 15 industries that we've picked as being the like top of the town when it comes to innovating new businesses that are not just based on either selling expensive dirt or, you know, financial services, which are some of the biggest exports. So the question is, what can we sell? What can we innovate to China that's not just, you know, coal, iron ore, food, or wine? What we're known for in China is exactly those things. So the biggest opportunity for us is to use the stereotype of Australia in China. So what our customers are already thinking we're good at. If we kind of blow into town and start talking about something that Australia was not necessarily known for, it's difficult to get those doors open. But if you go in and you're starting to talk about ag tech, Australia is very, very well known for having some of the best beef around, you know, some of the most gorgeous countryside. We're known for being clean, green, and safe. So we get very good conversations happening when it comes to sticking to that stereotype. So I would take the very uninnovative stereotype of Australia, which is, you know, a farm, a quarry, and a beach, and just figure out what the innovative edge of either any of those stereotypes are, and like run hard with that. So yeah, that's a very long answer.
But I think it's a good one because there's lots of questions about standing capabilities and where we can meaningfully compete. But I think that what you just said makes a lot of sense. One of the things that I would like to ask, like the whole panel, just to kind of open it up, is when it comes to safety or things like that, the tension point between privacy and innovation. We know Australia, very high privacy, very low innovation. Singapore's probably pretty flat. China's the exact opposite. So when we talked about before about having the AI facial recognition crossing the road with WeChat, you also have the same in aged care when you walk out going, no, the doors are open, because the police will return the wandering residents very quickly. So how, in the way that like all of you are seeing innovation sort of applied in a collaboration, are we understanding the challenges with the sorts of things we're trying to solve? It's sort of moving on from your point, but more about the fact that we look at that privacy innovation tension point much differently than they do in China. Yeah. Do you kind of take companies over there?
Yeah. It's it's a tough question. If we break it down, I guess, you know, I'll probably focus a little bit more on what I understand, and that's mostly helping these companies into the market. I think there's always a bit of a struggle for most going to China in regards to privacy. Is it safe? Can I actually produce or sell my products there without being copied directly? But more often than not, you will be copied. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. In many ways, it's helped a lot of companies actually open doors. There's a lot of great case studies where, because there were copycats in China, they actually educated the market, build your brand, and then you come in, go to court, get your trademark back, and actually have a market that's wanting your products. I think that's one thing. In terms of technology and privacy, I think that always remains an issue. The other way around as well, as we all know with Huawei and what's happening there at the moment. So I think that goes both ways.
On the IP issue, and I know that we had someone speak to us when we were in Beijing about the fact that there's, I guess, a narrative that it's impossible to enforce, it's impossible to trademark and, you know, patent, you know, your brand or your particular IP, but there seems to be more focus from China in making sure that the courts are able to kind of manage that IP process. Is that a recent thing? Would you agree that that's becoming more of a focus in terms?
There's the Chinese IP to protect finally.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Before they didn't have that.
Right.
Now they have an incentive to protect their IP. And it's a recent phenomenon, but I mean, that doesn't mean that, like you said, we're not taking the foreign IP. That's still pretty common occurrence.
Yeah, I think, you know, back in the day, I think that was the way for China, for most nations really to go forward, is by welcoming companies in, and in exchange for opening up the market to say Coca-Cola had to teach the locals how to actually make glass. This is actually the case in China. And by doing so, they were able to acquire those skills. Now they're doing the same with technology, right? Open the doors, let the technology come in, learn from it, just like many nations before have done elsewhere. And now, like you said, I think they're at a stage now, this happened a few years ago, where what they started finding is that this sort of loose IP regulation that they had worked very well in acquiring technology, but it didn't really allow Chinese companies to expand, because what started happening was they started copying each other. Now that became a big issue internally, and as they started developing their IP, it became, you know, it started to make a lot more sense to actually create a stronger IP framework to protect that. And nowadays, if you look at the actual rates of, you know, lawsuits in regards to trademarks, for instance, in China, 99% of the case, I think, the owner of the brand actually wins it. So I'd say the IP framework now is actually quite sophisticated, and in many ways you're quite well protected there. You know, you still may get copied, but again, I don't think it's that black and white. I don't think it's necessarily bad. I've seen some companies actually succeed by being copied and having the markets open up for them.
They put oil in the ocean. Let someone else boil the ocean, and he can come to
Oh, yeah, exactly.
I think it's also worth saying that there is, just in the past year, the beginnings of a privacy movement in China as well. There is a lot of surveillance, but there are sort of growing concepts as the middle class develops of a right to privacy. The chairman of Baidu famously said that the Chinese would happily exchange privacy for convenience, and there was a bit of a backlash to that, because he wrote, no, we're not going to make that exchange for these lazy things. And so I think there is actually a growing, although nascent, privacy movement in China itself.
Really interesting. Now, because I'm becoming famous for very long questions, this is again to all of you. So Huawei's CEO Ren Zhengfei hosted that press conference a couple of months ago, which was pretty extraordinary. It was very detailed and he was very magnanimous. And one of the things that he said, I think the question was phrased about the ownership of Huawei, and it was kind of purported, and the language was basically saying, you say it's one thing, but really you must be under your control by the Chinese government. But he said, first, I think there are a few success stories where public companies become strong and big. Capital tends to be greedy. When there's an immediate interest, capital tends to take it, and that would certainly compromise the long-term pursuit of ideals. We're a private company, so we're able to remain committed to our long-term ideals. I think certainly in our trip to China last year, we saw these incredible displays of very long, committed plans, whether it's Belt and Road, whether it's
I think most communist countries have these long-term plans. And I think that is a strength because race is now in a trade war with the US as well. The Chinese are thinking, look, we can just wait out until Trump is gone and you're the new president.
Right.
Right? And I think that makes a lot of sense, actually.
There's no democratic switch to turn on to deal with tensions there. Yeah, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but there's a famous Chinese saying of eating bitterness, and like the Chinese Communist Party can force feed bitterness if need be, as a goal of broader national struggle in a way. You know, so there is, and that's why you're seeing more nationalistic media coming out of China these days as a result of the trade war.
And also, the problems or the challenges for society are becoming more complex. So if you're looking at, we talked before about the pollution in China that you all lived through, and you know probably it's not on the brochures about how horrendous it can be, but there's also a sense that if anyone's going to really meaningfully address it in a wholesale way, it'll be the Chinese government. So I guess as the challenges get more complex and the ability to take that long-range view to address them, it does put China and other, I guess, communist countries in a different kind of, bucket when we look at the way that we organise ourselves globally.
I would say there's sort of maybe a tension between so the Chinese Communist Party being able to just starve out an external opponent outside, an outside economy, but internally it has to be very reactive to this rising middle class that we've been talking about. So the rise of pollution has actually been a destabilizing societal impact because people who have benefited from the economic rise of China don't necessarily want to be at risk of dying from pollution-related illness from living in these big flagship cities. So the Chinese government is one of the biggest investors in clean tech, which is great. It obviously needs to clean up its air, but it also needs to maintain harmony, which is a very key Chinese government proposition. How do you steer a harmonious society which is that large, changing that much, and with that many different perspectives within it? So I think the intersection between investment in innovation and societal rest and unrest and growth is really, really interesting. So it's not just China's never just one thing, right? Like it's always these multiple contradictory things. It's kind of like a kaleidoscope, and it's very interesting. So when we've got an investment in innovation that is on the one hand solving problems, it's actually solving multiple problems across the spectrum of society. So when Australia kind of swings in, we're like, right, well we've got some green tech, how can we help? Well, it's understanding what the actual problem might be and where we can best collaborate. Australia's not going to be able to make a scale play anywhere really, but in China, we can form effective partnerships that might be able to use our brand again of clean, green, and safe, specifically, and create some reliable solutions that the Chinese government might find very, very effective.
Just if I could add on to that, China, especially outside of the main cities, just adding on to what you said, which I think is completely correct, has suffered from thousands of environmental protests. Not like just like these, like let's say no, I'm being poisoned by this river. A former colleague of mine wrote a book back in 2008 called The River Runs Black. It talks about the price that China paid to become that manufacturer of the world. And so for many years, China's been acutely aware of this environmental challenge. And until recently, when I was in China 10 years ago living there, the most robust and strong and vocal NGO that I encountered my whole time there was Greenpeace. They were the ones given the most room to operate because the Chinese government realized how critical it was to get as much help as they could from these organizations. That said, they're nowhere, the size of them has shrunk considerably, and the whole NGO scene as a whole has suffered immensely under Xi Jinping. But before that, very vocal.
Can I just invite some questions? Maybe James, who has got a question. Any questions? Someone's pointing right.
Oh, I have a couple actually. I guess talking about portraiture and all that, have you found that made in China is becoming a bit shifted in the minds of people? I don't know, for example, Southern by now will say made in Democratic Republic of China rather than saying made in China. Is that like shifting? Like what is happening there?
I think they say made in the people's
Yeah. And it's like, I kind of like, I was like, maybe someone
It's like made in the Commonwealth of Australia.
And I'm wondering if that's like now becoming like,
It's very
are
much.
they trying to make it, you know, like,
Yeah, it's very much a conscious brand
Yeah.
awareness that they're taking there.
Yeah.
And as we said today, China's making leaps and bounds in a number of areas.
Yeah.
And it would be, from the Chinese perspective, it would be fantastic if they could make it on the tour. But again, you can't invent that soft power. You can't invent the allure of an amazing fashion line. You just have to have that integrity, have it, and let it be organic.
Yeah.
And so it's tough, but I see it changing.
I guess like on like for example, Vogue in China with the new Vogue made, is that improving that? And so I went to talk recently to the Street and I found that really quite fascinating. It's like, you get like 25 million viewership per month, which would be kind of generate like the population, but is that helping like locally and worldwide or
What do you mean by helping?
like shift the minds of made in China?
I mean,
It's
yeah.
a domestic audience.
Yeah, and like
Yeah,
getting
I mean-
people by, I guess, locally, yeah.
Yeah, the more voice that you can give Chinese citizens, the better the chance you have of an actual organic soft power, of actually organic,
Yeah.
attractive entity. You know, like I said before, you can't force feed these things. You have to let them grow by themselves. And you know, I think Vogue China is a fantastic move. That more voice for Chinese people to express themselves and to like creatively. That's fantastic. And that's the way to go for rebuilding that brand and reimagining that brand with made in China.
It's an interesting case study. Sorry to I just jumped all over you. Interesting case study of Madame Xi, so President Xi's wife. She only wears Chinese designers. So there's sort of, you know, that nationalist policy being seen on the body, you know, as well. So wherever she goes, domestically or internationally, she's really being proud with that. You know, there's no higher regard. But with Angelica Chung, like she is
Yeah.
such a boss.
Yeah.
Oh my god.
I love it all.
Yeah, she's incredible. So the editor-in-chief of Vogue China, she's the founding editor, so it's like 10 or 11 years old,
Yeah.
on trial now. Her readership is larger than American Vogue and British Vogue combined, just in 10 years, whereas those publications are about 100 years old. So for her, she's told me, because we're such besties, that she still has to have on her her spreads of, you know, an incredible Chinese actress or even international. She still has to have that Gucci or that Prada or whatever in there, but then she'll introduce Chinese brands in there as well. And without that international brand in there, it's not as cool. But nor would it be cool if it was all Gucci, Prada, whatever. You know, so there's sort of the Chinese millennial appetite for sort of more artisanal made, you know, smaller brands. Like it's a little bit naff almost to just be head to toe in like big brand names, and then you've got to kind of show your own personality through your purchases. It's not just about the sort of the big overseas brands or the big Chinese brands. I mean, you can see that in the rise of the KOLs, the key opinion leaders, and them turning into their own fashion designers and fashion houses as well. And I'm not sure if they've made it into, you know, a spread with, you know, a Gucci watch or whatever. But I'd say it's not too far away.
James?
I had a question probably for Jared, but whoever wants to go for it. I don't know what it was now, but that's not dissimilar to
Not a comment.
what you were saying. Well, just on the Huawei stuff, because it's kind of like that whole thing, the escalation of the trade war is interesting, but I mean, I don't think it's even inflammatory to say that where Huawei is now is standing on the shoulders of Cisco and a bunch of other companies, just in terms of industrial espionage or copying. But I wanted to ask, in terms of the biggest influence on the US-Australia relationship now is Australia's China relationship.
And the US is China.
And the US-China relationship. But for us, we're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place in some ways. And I guess, I don't know, are you a futurist? Have you got a crystal ball? Like, I mean, there is a, that's good.
No, I'm happy
to make some money.
Yeah.
No, I guess I'm asking, like, a lot of this is tied in with the technology. Because
what's going to happen next?
Like, whatever a trade war is, of course it's tech, because the future is tech. And it's a fight. So how hard's that fight going to get? You know, is it a die in a ditch kind of a battle, or what's the end game?
Yeah, I think we mentioned earlier, waiting for Trump to leave office and then maybe cooler heads will prevail. I don't think that's the case. I think we're locked into a great power struggle between the US and China, and it's bipartisan in the US. It's one of the few areas of bipartisanship in the US these days. Name any other topic that's bipartisan. The way to prosecute that tension with the US, that's where you have a debate. Even then, the degrees of that debate are not too wide until the latest tranche of tariffs by Trump. The Democratic Party was not complaining. So remember, Trump is Republican and the Democratic Party is the opposition. The Democratic Party, until just last week basically, was not complaining about what Trump was doing against China. What else are they not complaining about? Nothing. They're complaining about everything. This is the one area where they can agree. And even Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader of the Democrats in the upper parliament of the U.S. Congress, even said, following a tweet from Trump about making like the trade negotiations with China, Chuck Schumer said, stay strong, Mr. President. This guy does not say Mr. President, does not respect the president in any other way. This is the one area where there's basically consensus in many ways. China does really not have many friends in DC. With that said, there are still some friends of China outside of DC. You have some in the tech industry, have some in Wall Street. But even then, the challenge, this is, sorry to be long-winded, I'll finish quickly, but the way that the US engaged with China, the reason that the US engaged with China is that they exchanged market access for tolerance of political political lack of political freedom. So it said, all right, open up your markets, and slowly your middle class will call for democratic reforms, and that's the exchange we'll make. So we'll have free trade, or close to free trade. We'll welcome you into the World Trade Organization, and we'll be tolerant and patient, and while you guys make the necessary reforms. Xi Jinping has not only stopped those reforms, but in many ways moved backwards from those reforms. And that's why in DC, capital, you don't have a lot of people talking about the need for understanding China. I think in many ways in DC, they think they understand China perfectly well. And what's happening is just running out of patience with what's going on in China. And so you don't have the free traders, you don't have the businesses who are driving that relationship saying, oh, this is important anymore. In many ways, the businesses of, like, for example, the American Chamber of Commerce in China, they do fantastic surveys of the businesses there and their sentiment about operating in China. And it's just getting worse and worse, basically. So the people who are driving that relationship with China, the businesses, they're now going to the government saying, no, something has to be done. This isn't okay anymore. It's getting worse and worse. So that's why I think this is going to last beyond Trump and very well into the next administration after that.
So, sorry, I'm really interested to hear what you guys have got to say, because that's the kind of a macro view, and that's the environment that Australia has to operate in. And you guys have a much more kind of business to business type relationship building businesses. So how do you operate in that environment?
Well, okay, so I'll try and be the segue to bring it down from macro to micro. So the trigger for this current trade war is the Made in China 2025 policy, which is about seeing China maintain its current manufacturing capacity, but then have advanced manufacturing capacity or an advanced manufacturing capacity that is absolutely equivalent or even better than the United States. That's why the United States is annoyed. So when it comes to that, the trade war could subside if that Made in China 2025 policy goes away, which it won't. It absolutely won't. China is progressing. China's not going to go back to times when it made pig iron. You know, like it's like the 50s. It's going to be an advanced economy. That's the way it's heading. So that ship has flown, I think, and I'd love to see a nuanced understanding between two very, very large nations where they can effectively navigate the eclipsing of the US as the largest economy by China as the largest economy, because that has happened by some metrics and is about to happen by others. So there's no arguing about that. It's just how brutal are we going to be along that path. So when it comes to Australia, on the one hand, we have our politicians who will try to please our strategic partner and then displease our largest trading partner. So like that moment when Malcolm Turnbull got up and said in Mandarin, the Australian people have stood up. Like, oh my God, like he had this sort of viral moment in China, which made Chinese interference in Australian politics, equivalent and on par with when Mao Zedong said the same words, which was immediately following the Japanese invasion, with hundreds of millions of people dying. So very, very bad. Like talking about stepping on your tongue there. So when our Australian politicians try and please our strategic partner by making such faux pas, we really harm our relationship with our largest trading partner. So that sort of really big, broad brush stuff, which is not very nuanced, it's the sort of thing that you would expect from people who don't know that much about anything and see things in very black and white terms when the reality is far more nuanced and grey. So I'd really like to see some of our, some of our bureaucrats are actually freaking awesome when it comes to Australia-China relations. They've been there for a long time, they really get it. But when it comes to the partisan politics, it sort of seems to harm Australia a lot. And our politicians getting up and saying that sort of stuff doesn't create one Australian job. It just harms our opportunities with our largest trading partner. So I'd love to see it become a lot more nuanced, a lot more skilled. I'm hopeful, a little bit, but that's why I really believe in the sorts of work that we do, which is non-governmental, because we can have the sorts of conversations that might open up a lot more nuanced conversation than the sort of very public government conversations can. So yeah, China's here to stay. I really hope we don't mess it up. That's the TLDR.
Yeah, just something to add to that. I think Australia, in the context of China, doesn't really matter to China too much, right? I think that's just the case. Outside of the US, or maybe the European Union, there are not many that will affect China that much. And I think that's something we all need to keep in mind as well. As for your usual SME that's selling, say, milk powder to China, I don't think they really care. They're probably more worried about a recession that might be coming versus these political tensions. We may get hurt by whatever treaty that the US and China may come to, but I think in day-to-day sort of operation for most companies, they're happy to continue selling milk powder. And I'd say, as Scott Morrison recently said, the US is a good friend and China is a good customer. I said, let's not screw up our customer service and continue, exporting to China because they're providing, I think, the lifestyle that everybody's able to enjoy here in Australia.
And he caused a big furor on WeChat by saying, China's not a friend, they're a customer.
Just to add more nuance to that, China is undoubtedly Australia's #1 trading partner, but it's less discussed the fact that the U.S. is by far the #1 investment partner of Australia. The U.S. invests, or Australia receives more investment from the U.S. than anywhere else in the world. And Australia invests in the US more than anywhere else in the world. And then US firms also spend more on R&D here than basically anyone else. It's $1 billion a year that US firms spend on R&D here. And US and Australia are part of the Five Eyes Intelligence Agreement with the US, UK, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. And so as a result, you have like Boeing, for example, their largest footprint is here. So there is that security dimension that is very a huge source of discussion, but there actually is an economic relationship with the US as well.
Genuine case of dancing with two elephants, really, isn't it? And like to your point about pleasing the strategic partner and displeasing the big trading partner. I mean, in the Chinese relationship, we're going to get impatient with that whole thing.
Yeah.
And if you try and as Scott Morrison said, try and please the customer as opposed to the strategic partner, then Donald Trump's going to get impatient with that. I would think.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say from my experience coming to Australia after living in the States and living in China and seeing the discussions about China in Australia versus the discussions about China in the US, there's a huge difference. The business community and the strategic community here are very far apart, whereas I think I was mentioning before, the business community and the strategic community in the US are not as far apart.
But they've moved closer recently.
They moved closer recently, but why is that? Why is Australia different? And we talked about it before. What is Australia like trading with China? Iron ore, coal, and education.
International students.
Yeah, foreign students. You can't get burned on your IP there. And so, but as that relationship develops, you're probably going to see a bit more tension. Maybe people won't be as tolerant to their IP being taken. Like, I'm friends with former entrepreneurs who just left China. They're tired of dealing with it. It's just too much. You have the environmental stuff. They don't want to subject their families to that. Then you just have an increasingly surveillance state, and they don't want to deal with that. But then you also have the commercial pressure of you're a foreign firm. You're not going to get priority here. It's not going to be a fair. You're not going to get a fair go, to use the Australian lingo. And that's their sort of sentiment dealing with China. Obviously, that's not applicable to everyone, but I feel like the U.S. firms have probably been more diverse in China for longer compared to Australian firms. So that's probably one of the reasons why.
It isn't the major thing that the US invested in China and is dependent and it's got a lot of money at stake in fixed assets in China, whereas 90% of Australian trade into China, whether it's SME through to big guys, is throw it over the border or get the people to come to us.
Yeah, the US is that.
Therefore, we're in a far better position than the USA in that, and that's why there's a divergence between the business sector and the strategic sector. The other thing which people don't acknowledge in Australia is that the security interests are paid for by US defence contractors and European defence contractors. ASPI is basically paid for by those folks. And so we have a real divergence. I think it will still continue. The interesting thing that Duco mentioned earlier was this thing we ran here, 400 companies, and of them 200 spent 7 weeks doing an assignment a week on their China market entry. And of those 200, all of them were thrown over the fence. And they're all in unique areas of Australian comparative advantage, very similar to what Andrea said. They were things like organic foods of 100 different varieties or whatever. So if someone asked me what Australia should do, it's diversification of risk. And it's about removing dependency upon iron ore or whatever. It's about promoting those 200 companies or 300 companies and getting them doing their thing in areas where we can throw it over the fence and don't have the risk that the Americans have let themselves into by being beguiled by the China story.
Yeah, I think diversification is a big challenge for China. We just happened to talk to the university vice chancellors when 30% of their foreign students are Chinese. And I think it's a pretty well-known issue here where if you displease folks, you get some visits from the local government officials, the Chinese government officials. And that's, with that said, R&D at the universities is suffering and they really need the funds. So yeah, diversification is key. And I think you know that the US has invested a lot more in China than Australia. So that's why you see a different relationship.
Can I, we've got about 5 minutes left, and I just wanted to, there's about, I was counting, there's about 6 or 7 delegates from last year's trip in September, which was the first Listen, Learn, Connect, which is where we all attempted to kind of spend more time listening than talking, which is in a van or bus full of excited women, a bit tricky sometimes. But one of the things in the structure of last year's forum that was particularly interesting was that we went to preschools and kindergartens, we met with university students, we really looked at the change and the way, and we went to aged care facilities. So it was kind of applying that kind of innovation lens, but on the cycle of life, which was very well done, sort of Pan and team, because it suddenly made you realise where at some points that China and its culture were digging in. There are other parts where there was a conscious effort to equip people for a more broader kind of competitive landscape in terms of the skills coming through, etc. Does anyone have any comments or key takeaways that was on that trip about the things that sort of surprised you the most, or anything that you've heard tonight? Not to put you on the spot or anything. Yes.
Yes. My question is because regardless of the high growth of GDP in China, there's still a huge gap in the region, which is outside Shanghai and Beijing, and also they have a high national debt and high inflation rate. And many people just think the GDP rate is unrealistic and maybe it's unreal. So economy maybe suffer from some problems in the future. So what do you think of the future business environment in China?
Another big question. Yeah. Well, I'll take a quick stab. See what happens. So a lot of my experience in China is in rural and regional areas. I think rented a house for 6 months in a big city, but the rest of the time I've been in the western parts of China, where some of the poorest provinces are, some of the best food is, by the way, and having a lens on the many different Chinas, and many different therefore opportunities and ways that Australia can plug in. I think that is a really, really strong opportunity for Australia to be able to plug into some of those western areas where it's far, far, far less competitive. So say, just in that international student example, you still have a rising middle class in the west of China, and maybe unlike in Beijing, where you're competing with Harvard and Cambridge and the top 5 universities in the world for oxygen, Australian universities, which are still very, very good, can find a lot of wiggle room and a lot of place to help and to create opportunity there. So if you look at those really big macro economic trends, you can just say, oh, China is slowing down, that must mean that there is less opportunity. But China is never ever one thing, and you can find economic problems in one area which might be a business opportunity for you to help solve. It doesn't mean that there's no money for anything ever. It might mean that there's no money for things that you don't actually need, but you might be able to plug in really, really nicely. So yeah, it's a bit abstract, but I would say to try and make that land somewhere, you could, Australian businesses might find more match in terms of the sorts of scale that we can actually facilitate in some of the western provinces of China. Like, you got to think about every province in China has an economy the size of a country. That sort of greater Guangzhou area has an economy the size of Australia. So it's, I would say, if China looks like it's going downward, look deeper, and then Australian businesses still might find some good opportunities within the nuance of what is actually happening. Fuzzy answer, okay. Give me a question. Did you have a question?
If I might.
Yes.
But it's a more personal question than a big picture discussion.
So last year when I went on the mission, the delegation, my first visit into China, it was that classic eye-open, big wide eyes, this is amazing, trying to understand the big picture, and then understanding the skill that's needed to exist within the nuance of different perspectives, which is the other thing for everybody in actually thinking black and white. Just a bit further. My question is, what was the moment in your lives when each of you realised that this understanding China was the thing that you wanted to pursue? Because for each of you were specialists, what was it that caused you, what was the
China was interesting because it was a rising power. Nobody had been there. It was communist. So it was a bit of an adventure. That's why I went there. But then, as you spend a few months there, you see everything around you change. You see companies pop up. You see people change. It's like, hey, this is exciting. There's a lot happening here, and that's sort of what drew me in. What kept me there is just the rate of change, and that gives you opportunity to learn, to advance your career, to go on adventures, and that's sort of what kept me there. I think is just the pace of change.
For me, I am, as you can tell from the accent, American, but I also grew up between the U.S. and Israel, and my last name is Jewish, but my religion is actually Baha'i. And so I'm an American, Baha'i, Jewish last name who grew up in Israel. And I wanted to study the Middle East, but I couldn't go anywhere to do that. So my sister was living in China, and I visited, and we were lucky enough to travel considerably within Europe and Africa, and across the U.S. And I went to China, and it was unlike anything I'd ever seen. And this was 2007 when I first went there, and it was really at a tipping point. It could have gone a number of different directions, and I think it's unfortunately gone in a bad direction. But that said, it's still to this day the most unique experience I've ever had. And I tell everyone, like, you go to Latin America, you go to Africa, you go to Europe, you sort of know what to expect. You never know what to expect in China, and that's what I love about it.
Beijing, Betty.
Okay, so I've been going to China for 17 years. The first trip I ever took overseas was to China in 2002. I just graduated from a neuroscience degree and realized I didn't want to work in the lab. Whoops. So I saved up all my money and got my butt overseas for the first time. And I backpacked around by myself with no language. Whoops. And yeah, I know, but it was ace. Like, you know, people. I mean, obviously, I stand out quite a bit there, and so people were incredibly kind and incredibly helpful in helping me, you know, feed, clothe, you know, get accommodation every day. But I traveled from Beijing all the way to Xinjiang, which is like as far as you can go, basically, to the Pakistan border. I did this big round trip. It was probably about 30,000 kilometers. I didn't die. And I thought, this place is amazing. I could see so many different Chinas, even at that point. And from a little dodgy internet cafe in Sichuan province, which had like 500 people in it, all dudes, all smoking, all playing games. I applied for a master's degree because I thought, like, if I want to learn anything about this, I've got to work hard at it. I don't have a cultural, you know, understanding of this at all. So I you know, basically like being there on the ground and seeing everything changing in so many different types of China, and realizing that the limitation to understanding that was me. And so I sort of leaned in. Anyway, I took a punt, and in 2002, China had just joined the World Trade Organization, and this incredible economic story was really, you know, just about to absolutely explode. And so I could kind of get a hunch of that, but I didn't know anything about business on the sciences. So yeah, but I could get a sense of energy, you know, and something kind of on the cards. So it just sort of fit my personality, I think.
That era from 2002 to 2012 was a really, really fun period in China. And a lot of fun stuff was going on. And a lot of people I meet who still love China, it's because they first visited during that period.
So if you started after that, you're less likely to love China.
Because it's not as unique in many ways.
Right, yeah.
So that was a unique period, I feel like, in China's history.
Yeah.
But there's a thing, one of the things you said, I think really what all three of you said, was curiosity and the willingness to just roll with the fact that you don't know what to expect. And that's the thing that frightens me. And I think the thing that CATIC Trip did was actually, and answered it again, getting people from 0 to 1 to get over any. And the fear is almost fiction telling, we all tell ourselves this. But I thought that was specific for us. And I've been long working back to 2002. I thought that was what was really clever about it. And I was intrigued by people treated so clearly so in life. So fascinating, right? So it has
terms of tapping into the personal journeys that you've all been on, to be able to share incredible insights with us all tonight. Very valuable. Thank you so much. Can you join me in thanking the panelists? We have a book to give away that Professor David Walker, I can remember the first one, I can't remember the one that you won, but it is basically a 20-year next version of analysing, I guess, Australia's relationship with China. It's a fantastic book. I've read a chapter, I've read the cut-down version, so that's going to be good. But we can't do business cards, because no one has business cards, so I thought we'd just do, if anyone's interested in it. Can anyone remember exactly how many people that Andrea brings together in total for the CAMP project?
100.
There you go.
Okay.
I was reading a book. Thank you, everyone. Someone